My name's Dawn Iwamasa, and I am a second-year doctoral student over at Florida State University in Tallahassee. And I will be doing a presentation with Cheryl Benz, and I'll have her introduce herself. The way we're going to do this is I'm going to talk for a little bit, Cheryl's going to talk for a little bit, and then I'm going to talk for a little bit. So it's a switch off of a presentation.
And good afternoon. I'm Cheryl Benz. I'm the Creative Arts Clinical Coordinator at the University of Kentucky Healthcare, and delighted to be with you this afternoon. So, Dawn.
Thank you. So I want you to imagine for a minute what it might be like for us to have music therapy research with an N of 2,000, or an N of 4,000, or a national multi-site research study that shows music therapy's effectiveness in different parts of the country. Perhaps maybe we're able to prove efficacy in the real world for something like autism spectrum disorder, or perhaps even pain management in the hospital. So I'm going to talk to you about a national database, a network of databases that we're hoping are going to help us answer some of those questions. So back in 2010, there was this small piece of legislation called the Affordable Care Act. I don't know if you've heard about it. But in this law that was signed in 2010, there was a charge in there that the United States needed to invest in an infrastructure to help us do large-scale research, patient outcome research. And so as part of the Affordable Care Act, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, called PCORI, was formed. They were charged, again, like I said, to provide and develop a national infrastructure for research. So in 2013, the vast majority of the funding that PCORI got went into developing the PCORnet, and that's the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Network. And what PCORnet is are large databases of patient information from around the country. Some are metropolitan cities, some are states, some are regions of the country. And all of the data, the patient data in these databases, are anonymized. So there's some demographic information that you can see or research, but everything about the patient's treatment in healthcare. That might be in the hospital setting, it could be in outpatient clinics, some of it is insurance claims data, and I think down the line, the hope is to have Medicare and Medicaid data in there as well. Right now, PCORI's budget is about $500 million. The vast majority of that is to fund research. So they are largely a funding organization. And about $150 million of that comes directly from the Treasury, and about $350 million of their budget comes from a $2 fee from every single individual's healthcare plan, whether that's Medicare, Medicaid, private, employer. So if you think about $2 of your premium basically goes to PCORI for research. So the PCORnet, in order to accommodate data from different healthcare networks, different hospitals, different electronic medical record systems, needed to build something where all of the data would look the same when it got put into these databases. And so what they came up with is something called the common data model, which is computer speak across lots of different database types of infrastructures, but the common data model here is specific to being able to query healthcare outcomes. PCORnet is a network of networks. So there are 13 of these massive research bases across the country. It consists of 5 years of data and represents nationally about 128 million patient records. So as you can see, PCORnet has the common data model, lots of language there that some of it we are familiar with. So CPT codes are things that we talk about in music therapy. Another might be our diagnosis codes that are given by some other healthcare profession. So this is basically the common data model. This is the types of data that is put into this database. That is how we can query information. The types of research that PCORnet is intended to provide are things like pre-research questions where you can create a cohort. For example, at Florida State University, we do a lot of studies in the NICU, and so we can query by diagnosis code. We can do exclusions of different other types of diagnoses or medical conditions or things that are happening or surgeries that they've gotten where you can exclude them from a particular cohort to get down to a particular specified group that you want to study. And what this allows us to do is to be able to see what is the aggregate count in this database. Does it represent thousands of people? Does it represent 2 people in your cohort? So that you can determine, well, do we want to go forward with a research study? Is it worth it for us? Or do we need to look at a different criteria for looking at these studies? A lot of these studies are going to be retrospective in nature, right? Because what we have now is things that have already happened, and we're looking back to see what is happening in healthcare. The other part that PCORnet is going to be helpful in developing research are your clinical trials. So they're also developing a way of matching researchers with subjects. So while the data is actually anonymized, it's all anonymous data, if you work through the PCORnet or one of your research networks, you go through one IRB process to have access to multiple sites. That's really exciting for researchers. Oftentimes when we have multi-site studies, we have to go and negotiate our IRB process with each individual institution. Sometimes if it's attached to the research institution or a medical school or a university, we have to negotiate all of those IRBs with every single institution that's involved. So what's beautiful about the PCORnet is that they'll be able to match you with patients. They'll be able to say, okay, so this person meets your criteria for your study. We're going to then go through an honest broker, and that broker can contact that individual to determine whether they can be a subject in your study, if they're going to participate and volunteer for your study. So this could help us in the future to look at trials, music therapy trials, across the nation or within a network of data, of patients. So next, Cheryl is going to talk about what they do at University of Kentucky Healthcare in their charting as an example of a really fantastic way of music therapists to chart in the electronic medical records in best hopes of providing ways for researchers to look for music therapy data in these networks. After she talks about their model, I'm going to talk about One Florida, which is the database that we used at Florida State to look to identify music therapy patients in the database. So now I'm going to talk about a pilot project that I did a little earlier this year, where I looked at one of the clinical research network databases called One Florida. So One Florida is just one of those networks in the PCORnet. So this is an example of the kind of data that is provided in this one database, one of those 13 CDRNs. One Florida right now has about 5 years of data, 15 million patients in the state, and that represents data from 22 hospitals, all of the counties within Florida, and about 4,000 physicians and 1,200 practices. So these little dots are where the data comes from. So as you can see, it's pretty representative of the entire state for the most part. These CDRNs are actually clinical data research networks like One Florida are really supposed to represent about 70% of the population within each of those CDRNs. So if it's a metropolitan area like Chicago, the data in that particular database should represent 70% of the population. So the research questions that I wanted to look at was, how are we charting in medical records? And do we code to identify music therapy? How do we code for music therapy? How do we track referrals? All of those types of questions. I wanted to know whether or not music therapist services were actually reported in the One Florida data, in the data trust, in the database. And then, what are the best practices? What did I learn about this so that we can maybe move towards a more standardized way of charting in electronic medical records so that when data becomes available in these databases, that it's the higher likelihood that we will find patients who received music therapy and what those specific outcomes of those patients are. So the first thing I did was interview music therapists in the state whose hospitals I knew provided data into One Florida. And what I found was that 2 of the hospitals in the database actually bill or code CPT in the NICU. These codes that are used in the NICU, and this is what's really interesting, is that the codes that are used were not used by any other discipline in the NICU. So while CPT codes are not discipline specific, as Cheryl had mentioned, really anybody can use them in theory. What they negotiated was that the CPT codes used in the NICU with particular patients with the diagnosis that typically children in the NICU have are not being used by a speech therapist or occupational therapist who's also working in the NICU. So this is really important in looking at the data because then we know the likelihood that the service was actually provided by a music therapist was actually us and not somebody else, and we're not tracking data from another profession. So then I sent a query to One Florida and asked them, can you tell me what the prevalence of these CPT codes with these diagnoses is in the database? So here's what I got back from them. The beautiful thing about One Florida, I can't speak for all the other CDRNs because I haven't worked with them, but in One Florida, we can query for aggregate counts, numbers, without having to go through IRB approval. What's nice about that is I can get a sense of, how many patients, but I don't get anything that would require a higher level of stratification of the data. So I'll talk a little bit about that later on. So for the 7 codes that I was given by those 2 hospitals that they use, and they both use them for the same things. Because this is documented in the music therapy NICU training literature that these codes were negotiated in the NICU to be billed or used to identify music therapy services in the NICU. So where you see the non-filtered count here, all it said was in the entire database, how many times, how many units is this particular code showing up? So 92526, which is actually for lack of a better way of describing it, it's a feeding code. It's not specific to the PAL, but it is a code used to treat feeding disorders. we got 87,000 units. So then you see here at the end here for about 4.5 years of data, with those 7 codes, we had 385,000 hits in the state of Florida. So then I asked them to filter it by diagnosis. So I gave them the ICD-9 and ICD-10 codes for the premature and low birth weight newborns. So I had to provide both ICD-9 and 10 because 10 has only been used more recently, but there's 4 years of data. So prior to using ICD-10, which has only been around for a couple years, everything prior to that was coded in ICD-9. So they want both ICD-9 and 10 codes. So then you see the filter by the diagnosis, which is for the 87,000 units, 27,000 of those were used with premature and low birth weight newborns. And then finally I asked, can you identify how many distinct patients? Because as we know, units just is a unit of time. It doesn't say one patient. You could bill or code for 3 units for 1 patient. So in this last column, what you see are the distinct patients in each of those CPT code categories. So in 4.5 years, it said 1,719 babies were coded as having these procedures. Now, I know in 2 of the hospitals that provide data that represent specifically music therapy. Wonderful, I think. I go back to the literature and I look at some of the caseload information and I think, okay, well, 4.5 years of data, 2 hospitals, 1,700 patients, sounds about right. Well, sounds about right is not really an adequate answer to a research question. So there is a problem with this data. The next step for this project is to go back to One Florida and ask them to stratify the data by hospital. Because it could be that the 719 patients here come from a hospital or a location other than the 2 hospitals that I know bill. And it could be that they represent a different discipline. Because who's to say a speech therapist or occupational therapist isn't using that code in a hospital that's not the 2 that I know are using music therapy. So it's going to be really important for me to go back and ask them, can you stratify this data by location, by hospital, or can you only pull the data from these 2 hospitals? And that will require me to go through their IRB process. So that will be my next step in answering this research questions. So recommendations, based on my conversations with the music therapists that I talked to, what we know about the common data model at this particular point, we still know that CPT codes and diagnosis codes are the best way of identifying information and cohorts of people in the common data model. The next step potentially could be to ask therapists to provide national provider identification so that we can sort by specialty. NPI, as it's called, is a taxonomy. So when you get your number, it's assigned to you, and you are assigned to a taxonomy, and music therapy is part of that taxonomy. So NPI number, provider number is in the common data model, but we know right now not all of the NPI numbers are being downloaded. As the common data model is updated, as they change what information they want to provide in these databases, that's information that's going to be put in there. So for example, in the One Florida, there are only 2 hospitals that are providing NPI data. NPI is something that a lot of people in private practice use to bill or to identify services if they're doing any type of reimbursement. Observational and retrospective studies with large numbers of participants could be possible using PCORNet database. So if we are able to identify which patients are actually getting services from music therapists and what kind of interventions are being used or for what diagnosis or for what reason, then we're going to be able to track potentially thousands of people across the nation. And that's really exciting from a research standpoint. If you think about what the implications for us from a policy standpoint, or for you to be able to advocate for music therapy as a standard of care, you're going to have those large ends. You're going to have to be able to prove that there's efficacy in what we do. And this is going to help us do that. And what's beautiful about it is that it's pragmatic. So when we look back in time for services that have already been rendered, we know that even though there's a ton of variables that happen in somebody's life, music therapy is still very effective. So for example, we have really nice data of in the NICU where length of stay, we're able to prove that with music therapy interventions that NICU babies go home sooner. The largest study for that is about 100. Wouldn't it be great if we had an example of 2,000 or 3,000 at multi-sites that are able to tell us that in the real world, not in the research world where we're able to exclude all these different variables, that we're still able to get the results and magnify our effectiveness. With all of that said, we still need to know more about this common data model. It's constantly being updated. What we do know is I can't send them a phrase saying, can you just search for the words music therapy in the records and see if that shows up? That's not how the common data model works. It's really meant to be a very specific, direct, queryable information. And so then you can stratify data by things like pain scores and length of stay, their vital signs, things like that. So what we know right now at this point in time is that CPT codes, diagnosis codes, are going to be the best way for us to be able to look at this data. We still have a ways to go, so I want to encourage us to think about those and advocate for that. Cheryl talked about, even though you may not bill for the services using the CPT code, the charge can be zero, can be $0.0, but you can still use the code. So we know there are hospitals that are able to still say we're billing for a CPT code without actually generating a charge. But that's hospital specific. If you don't ask, you don't advocate, we don't know what the answer is, right? So basically I'm spreading the gospel of CPT codes. It is not perfect. However, it is the best we have right now when it comes to looking at research questions for large scale. Hopefully, things like NPI numbers are going to be something we're going to be able to integrate as time goes on.